Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Pleasure to welcome you to Sudden Exposure, where apparently we're all sex guests.
Lean into it.
First time to be so characterized, but hey, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this forum, this workshop for the day. A bit of background on David Theodolbert, for those who don't know, Forest of UCHRI, this organization here. This has been put together by Alison and Andriata, who worked for us, and has taken the lead putting it together. The staff sitting on the wall, I don't know why it's sitting on the wall, looking inconspicuous. Even though their contribution to putting this together has been conspicuous. So I'm very thankful to everybody both for being here and for helping to make this happen. A little bit of background, and some questions heard from different folks around the table before we go around and do introductions. This has emerged out of in a way, fairly long-term thinking at the Institute, which translated into a Mellon Foundation grant, separate from the big public announcement we made about getting this for an endowment. So a separate set of project-driven grant from Mellon. The overarching undertaking of which is really to think seriously about new directions in the humanities and humanistic thinking, to be able to forge new, not just new things that the humanities should be paying attention to, but ways of doing in the humanities that are a break with the convention, right? So when we think about conventionality in the humanities, it's about close reading, it's about analysis, it's about textual interrogation, to use that term, another term I'm particularly driven by, because interrogation has other kinds of connotations, of course. But those are the kinds of conceptions that get drawn into a self-understanding of what's being done. Textual in the broad sense of the textual, not just books. Images, sounds, textual and multimedia text. And of course that is not unimportant, quite the contrary. I mean, it's currency of the humanities, but it also has a boundedness to it, and we're interested in what happens at the boundaries and beyond, and to think of other ways of opening up those boundaries to different ways of insight, different ways of conception, different ways of even analytics that are productive. And so, when you think of it in those terms, experimentation obviously becomes a central feature, a central undertaking, a central disposition in relation to the world generally, in relation even to the conventional objects of analysis within the humanities. And so we thought we would push the button a bit and see what comes out of those who engage in experimental work, thinking about experimentation, and what might come out of an engagement together, a set of conversations, with the view, quite possibly, given what goes on today, to opening it up to new forms of engagement that are mutually compatible, right? And we obviously have some funding for that, and put some funding into seeing what might be of interest that says to others, both across the University of California, but in the world more largely, in the world of the humanities more largely. There are other ways of thinking at work over here from really creative people, worthy of an attentiveness to pull us in different directions and ones we perhaps been in. And it's not, of course, unrelated to the fact that, while I think we should avoid talk of the crisis of the humanities, when hasn't it been a crisis in some self-understanding or another, it's not, that too is not a very productive way of thinking, but it is the case that across the humanities generally, enrollments have been dropping again. I can give you the figures, they're quite sort of staggering. It's now under 8% of enrollments at the university at large. Not just at the University of California, which is slightly ahead of others, but nationally and internationally, in the global north at least. And to think of other ways of getting the people who come to study at universities thinking differently about what they think or don't think about the humanities and how it might be of not just appeal but also of considerable importance to their way of dealing with the world. So all of this is not unrelated to a larger project about rethinking the arts education, in which we're also quite deeply involved, both with the Mellon Foundation and others nationally. So that's the small scope of the project. We would like this to be, really an engagement with each other. We're in the work of running all kinds of workshops like this, and we find that workshop engagement like this, where we're really thinking together with pretty much no holds barred, is the best way of sort of getting people to think outside the box and outside of the constraints of the institution, of not meeting in the institution, for instance, really to think together in ways we think would be most productive. And so, with that, I don't know if Alison, you can tell me about this. Do you want to say?
Sure. Thank you so much, first of all, for being here. I'm just absolutely thrilled that there's been so many people, at least receptive, and also, if not knowing fully what was going to exist, then at least willing to play along once the steps were revealed. So I really appreciate that. I think it's just already set such a wonderful tone for what experimentation should be. Just thinking about it conceptually, I mean, there was multiple directions I thought this could go. We could sit and talk theoretically about experimentation. We could sort of enact experimentation, which is what I'm hoping will sort of transpire today. And I know a lot of people don't really know what's going to happen, where this will go, what kind of directions it'll take, and so we're kind of open to whatever kind of transpires here today. So thank you for that. Just on a different level, I mean, when we think about experimentation, in at least trying to outreach to different disciplines, et cetera, mostly because experimentation is often thought of in context of the sciences and scientific method and that kind of strategic approach to reaching a conclusion. And it's just whether those types of methods, or even experimentation within the alchemy of the arts, et cetera, that the humanities have sort of gripped onto, whether those types of models can be used in the humanities and how it would look. And so a lot of the breakdown of today was just a little bit of play and fun on my part to see what it would look like to sort of enact these certain methodologies to take us out of our sort of normative conceptions of research models. So I don't really want to take much of our time, but that's all to say I'm very grateful you guys are here, and I'm excited for your own kind of experience today.
So Patricia, just go around the table, say who we are.
My name is Melanie Jew. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English at UC Santa Barbara.
My name is Avery Truffleman. I work for a podcast called 98% Invisible. It's about architecture and design.
My name is Jen Young. I'm an assistant professor at UC Davis.
My name is Jocelyn Fernando. I'm a professor emerita at Communication Center.
My name is Leah Verdugo, and I'm assistant professor of design in the Department of Art and Architecture at the University of San Francisco.
I'm Karen Barad. I'm a professor of feminist studies, relations with history, consciousness, and philosophy. UC San
Simon Penny, I'm officially Professor of Electronic Art and Design at UCI.
And unofficially?
Unofficially, disruptor at large.
That's why you're here, yeah.
I teach philosophy at Santos.
Kalindi Bora, faculty in gender studies and science and technology studies at UC Davis.
My name is Eli Vargas. I'm a PhD in film and digital media at UC San.
I'm Gary Fox. I'm a PhD candidate at UCLA in history of architecture.
I'm Lisa Cartwright, and I'm a professor of visual arts and communication and science studies and critical gender studies in San Diego, UC San Diego.
I'm Dorothy Santos. I'm a first year PhD student in the digital media at UC Santa Cruz.
And I'm Gabi Schaffzin. I'm a third year PhD student in visual arts with art practice concentration. At UC San Diego. I saw everyone else do it first, so I had no idea.
And there's two participants en route, but they will introduce themselves when they get here.
Should we just start it?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Rosalindo was kind enough to introduce section 1. Oh. As a request.
Was awarded my question.
Could we just introduce, I guess I could introduce all of the participants?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
We have a description of our assignment of how might a project or response to constraint, what is brought to the fore, what gets left behind. And so each of the participants will have 7 minutes to present their work, adhering to the following parameters. Presentations must be made with a combination of citation, image, mathematical language symbol, and each element of citation, image, symbol will account for at least 1 minute each. Presenters are free to divide their 7 minutes however they choose. For example, 2 citations, your mathematical symbols, 1 citation, 1 image, mathematical. And among the questions they will address is what survives translation from one's word to another, citation, from one discipline to another, image, from one lexicon to another, symbol. Also, they're asked to consider the impact of imposed parameters on the purity of an idea. And our presenters are Gary Fox, Melanie Ju, Dorothy Santos, and Gabi Schaffzin. Did I pronounce that? I can do the Spanish name really well.
Eastern Europeans ruin everything.
Gary, do you want to start us off?
I'd be happy to. Is there the clicker for the, thank you.
Do you have a clicker?
Yep. Ready to go. Thanks.
If anyone has any trouble hearing, this microphone is available.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
can.
that'd be nice.
Yeah.
So the other one, this one, you want to steal it?
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
You probably have to get kind of close to it.
Sure. Is this helping? Yeah. Is this even on? Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Hi everyone. Thanks David and Allison for organizing. Thanks Argon for inviting me to apply to the workshop. I'll just jump into the material. I'm not sure how well I responded to these constraints, these parameters, but I'm happy to take on the challenge. So I opened with a case study which illustrates the contours of a larger dissertation project I'm currently working on. Not far from here at Berkeley's College of Environmental Design, the architect Donald Appleyard and the psychologist Kenneth Craig began in the early 70s developing what would come to be called the Environmental Simulation Laboratory, as we see represented in the image on the screen. The laboratory was intended to serve as a testing ground for, quote, basic research on environmental perception, allowing the experimenters to stage scientifically controlled studies on issues of aesthetic and perceptual response to various spatial variables. The team set out to develop a simulator which would allow two-scale eye-level views taken from within architectural models, cast by way of closed-circuit television to television monitors, as you see in the image. In the end, they received $1.3 million in National Science Foundation funding by about 1975. The question I ask is, why the desire to simulate in this historical moment? Okay. The case study, which I'll return to, forms part of a bit broader dissertation project which I'm currently developing. The project builds, in a sense, off of a series of provocations initially put forth by the architectural historian Siegfried Gideon. Before the Second World War, Gideon had championed a vision of technological modernization, which was for him homologous with modernism in architecture. But after the war, he takes a sharp turn, arguing that we can't any longer think of the mere materiality of the building, which he terms the inorganic, outside of its necessary integration with issues of bodily comfort, food production, cleaning, refrigeration, bathing. So he asks, what happens when mechanization, the logic of modernism, encounters organic substance? He historicizes then in this context, in 1948, a longer trajectory of the attitude of culture toward our own organism, which, he argues, whether organic or inorganic, this constitutes experimentation with the very roots of being, the idea of humanity itself. This is a challenge that he's putting forth in 48. This opens up a line of thinking in architectural history, and one that has been influential in my work, about the relationship of the organic to the inorganic, materiality to the body, and perhaps more broadly, objectivity vis-a-vis subjectivity. As myself, historian of architecture, I try to ask, how are these relations, these dichotomies produced, and to what effect? So we return to this case study of the Environmental Simulation Laboratory at Berkeley, where, as kind of a first order, in order to allow for any sort of experimentation to take place in the laboratory, the architect and psychologist, Appleyard and Craig, first set out to demonstrate the epistemological validity of their laboratory tool. To do so, they attempted to measure the real against the simulated. So they first took test subjects on drives along Huntington Avenue in Boston, asking for responses to perceived scenes, both in verbal terms and on numerical scales. The team then measured these responses taken in the real against similar responses to scenes reproduced in the simulator. The Appleyard and Craig would find that the subjective responses to both the real and the simulated, for the most part, corresponded, and thus they demonstrated, they'd argue, the validity of their simulator. So human subjectivity in this way was served to validate the objectivity of the experimental apparatus. You'll recognize, of course, that the images are here divided. We have male subjects, female subjects, college subjects, and less educated subjects. This brings me to the mathematics that I use very loosely, very metaphorically. Forgive me. Kenneth Craig, the psychologist in the team, was trained as a personality psychologist, and he was interested in resisting a kind of monolithic understanding of personality or subjectivity, and thus we get the desire to split subjects into less educated, more educated, male and female. Of course, this was not by any means an unproblematic assertion. They would argue in their research that less educated subjects were more concerned with qualities of surfaces, levels of maintenance, cleanliness. They would argue that women were more interested in concrete details, subjective concerns like danger or chaos, where educated men were more focused on issues of abstraction. They would argue, for example, they would ask, does this mean less educated subjects like the sense of being on a straight, uncomplicated stretch of road? The project at the Simulation Laboratory participates in this way in a broader historical phenomenon, which others have pointed out in architectural history and elsewhere, with Jane Cooper's, Joy Novello, Raymond Dutta. Of course, this follows a longer characterization of the postmodern condition, Guittard and Jameson, in different valences. But this process of division, I'd argue, this process of dissection was merely a first step in reconstituting a new body politic, one which would initiate a kind of legally actionable aesthetic guideline. We looked at views produced in the simulator by the psychologist Jack Woolville, who tried to study responding to a broader cultural concern around development pressures on natural environments. He sought to predict the appropriateness of development in natural landscapes. He used the simulator to produce these archetypical landscapes, placed 72 different scale buildings atop them, measured 80 test subjects' responses to these natural landscapes, and argued that there was a negative correlation between the landscape's perceived degree of visual contrast and aesthetic favorability. He would argue very clearly that the environment is not in the head. In this way, Lowell sought to develop an objective understanding of subjectivity, arguing that human behavior constitutes merely one participant in the functional relationships constituting any ecosystem. The resulting psychoaesthetic facts, this is my last slide, were not only intended to undergird radically new design knowledges. The simulation lab's capacity to place viewing subjects in simulated landscapes under experimentally controlled conditions undergirded the development of participatory aesthetic epistemology, whose effects were as juridical as much as they were architectural. As a result of the 1969 passing of the National Environmental Policy Act, there was importantly a provision for the communication of aesthetic impacts of any proposed project. And in a series of controversial trials in 1981, the Louisiana Department of Transportation was ordered to produce simulations in the simulator at Berkeley, where they attempted to measure and predict aesthetic responses to the various alternatives for the routing of the highway. The highway was ultimately rerouted as a result of this court order. The bridge was routed to the site and proven in the simulator to yield the lowest aggregate negative aesthetic impact. And so simulation lab in this way reconstitutes, I'd argue, a politically actionable aesthetic epistemology. In the context of my broader dissertation project, I looked to various other collaborations between architects and psychologists working to establish a new regime of subjective facticity, looked to solitary confinement studies, retail research, wayfinding studies, each mobilizing novel technological apparatuses as in the vein of the one we see here. And I'd argue in the context of this broader workshop question, the issue of experimentation and experimentality becoming hugely important in this context. In the context of architecture, the word experimental, experimentation often had long been in vogue as a descriptor, usually used to describe prototypes or mock-ups, one-offs, but it never in fact pointed to the use of the scientific method with requisite hypotheses, variables, control groups until the early 50s, as some of my other case studies point to. So I'd ask, what do we mean by this term in the context of architecture and in the context of cultural production more broadly? What sort of genealogy of this use of the term might become productive? When does it become valuable, of value, and why? Perhaps there's a degree of remove, a form of abstraction that adheres in the term experimentation. And this kind of speaks to my ultimate guiding research question: how is knowledge produced of the subjective? How is this knowledge deployed? And how is subjectivity reconstituted through this form of knowledge production? That's it.
I thought there was a 7-minute alarm.
No.
I'm sure I know.
Gary, could you explain? I hope I didn't impose too much, but I love the idea of translating the idea into the mathematical, just like into symboli in general. But could you explain it a little bit? Because I can't tell if we're looking at it as a visual model, like if we're looking at the division sign visually, or if we're actually interpreting it as dividing, or what?
Yeah. So I thought through for a good amount of time this issue of mathematical symbols that represent one word through this alternate language. And I guess I used it metaphorically to argue that there's a division of subjectivity that these psychologists and architects were interested in dividing the subject into less educated, more educated, male and female, and then they reconstitute by way of these simulator-based studies, they reconstitute a new body politic, if we can call it this, through production of objective data around subjectivity. So the summation sign was meant to speak to this reconstitution in a metaphorical sense, nothing else.
Yeah. How was experimentation sort of engaged in terms of, because what you're doing is like, if you're combining psychology with architecture, in what way is that, because often the idea of just experimenting on just even a minute level seems to me like there is a sense that there's the idea of creating the humanity as like this sort of general concept, that they're sort of experimenting with the idea of a human subject as cohesive whole, like as a representative of a cohesive mental whole. That I don't know how that actually ended up bleeding into architecture, or was that a slow process of integrating psychology?
Yeah, so I think that the first incursions of psychology into architectural thought happened much earlier, but it was a very different valence. So Gestalt psychology becomes influential in the analysis of architecture and its history at a much earlier date. By this historical period, by the mid-50s, then this becomes injected to experimental psychology. So rather than other forms of psychological inquiry, it becomes the experimental psychological that takes on a kind of important valence in this moment, more broadly, outside of architecture, and then kind of enters architecture by way of personality psychology in this moment. And it could be argued then that this reconstitutes, so we move away from the model of the ideal holder of an architectural object or an object more broadly, and this becomes particularized, so we have the production of the idea of the user rather than the ideal beholder.
Right.
A very different,
Absolutely.
different valence.
Right? Because it's moving beyond aesthetics into like, yeah, absolutely.
I was focusing on your, the use of the psychology part of it. So what kind of, maybe you answered this and I missed it, but what sort of like school of psychology was it? Cognitive psychology, was psychoanalysis part of, the sort of parameters which they were working in terms of like the relationship between architecture and the personhood or the
I would say it wasn't. It was more emerging, rather than psychoanalysis, it was emerging from a lineage of behavioral psychology and behaviorism and experimental psychology as well. So resisting a kind of individual focus in favor of a kind of broad pooling, allowing the production of data to produce kind of a set of standards around behavioral psychology.
Was the concept of subjectivity philosophical rather than a school of thought in psychology? If you were behavioral, that was interesting.
Precisely. I think it was not philosophical. It was very explicitly intended to be scientifically verifiable, produced through objective analysis. So perhaps the term subjectivity was kind of occupied.
That's leaning in the direction of getting rid of it.
Yes. Yes.
So, okay.
It is okay with me. In the sense that it's work that I historicize, and I'm interested in getting away from, if you can describe it this way, the transformation of the ideal beholder, a psychological subject, into something that becomes called later the user, someone who's subjected instead to these kind of mechanistic understandings of behavior in space. As a result of spatial variability.
I was really interested in one of the last things you said about this political aesthetic epistemology with the highway study, this idea of the highway looks nicer there. I don't think I've ever looked at a highway and thought to myself, that looks nice there. I don't think that a highway looks nice when on it. Like the feeling, that driving feeling of like, the view ahead of me. And of course we know like highways are often used to divide neighborhoods. And I was really interested in this idea that highway looks nice there. And if you could talk a little bit more about like how that was used in the court case and when that ended, and like is there a political epistemology of that highway looks nice there?
It's interesting. So when highways first are being developed in the United States, there's an effort to turn these scenic parkways. And there's suddenly a lot of funding for research into how to make highways scenic to serve as a form of recreational practice. And so the psychologists and architects I'm looking to produced a number of highway studies in advance of the studies at Berkeley, particularly in the context of MIT, and we're attempting to understand the recreational component of highways. We can map this onto a broader cultural turn toward RVs and practices of tourism which involved driving on highways to remote locations. And this was actively a pursuit of both the architect and the psychologist separately in their work prior to their collaboration with Berkeley. We do see a number of other kind of court cases litigated on aesthetic grounds in the period immediately following the signing of the National Environmental Policy Act, 69, court cases around power plants and different infrastructural forms which are considered to have negative aesthetic impacts. They're adjudicated based on that very issue, and simulations were produced in those cases as well to kind of prove what the impact would be.
I mean, exactly in that context, go back to the behavioral considerations of this. I mean, the crude behavioral consideration is that to do the psychological study in order to determine what the built environment, how the built environment might better control or determine the behavior of the subjects in it. What you're suggesting is a more complicated sort of self-understanding, where aesthetic consideration gets taken into account as part of the user experience. But one wonders whether there's not an extension of that then says people are more inclined not to act out in environments in which they feel better, right? In which they feel, aesthetically kind of embedded in a way that doesn't. So you might have less accidents on the highway that are, more aesthetically pleasing, although if you're looking at the highway and not looking at the car in front of you, that's open to question. But yeah, so I'm just sort of thinking about the sophistication of the sort of instrumentality at work.
Completely. I think it's an interesting provocation because then later studies, this immediately is co-opted for purposes of retail research. So how do
wouldn't that tie into the aspect from a political standpoint? You had environmental issues, so the politics of environment.
Yes.
What about all that fascism in architecture? I mean, isn't it well known for that? Where it's oppressive and meant to be, to display power over people?
So I think this emerges out of kind of participatory ethos, the desire to account for user experience, to resist the sort of top-down nature architecture as it was deployed through the 20th century. So this emerged from politics of including subject participation in design of various projects. But then quickly was, perhaps as David is suggesting, co-opted into a more insidious form of control, mobilizing, mechanizing.
So, can I take a conversation in a slightly different direction? Because what I was taken by was the video simulation aspect of
Yes.
what you were presenting, which was really fascinating. And what it reminded me of immediately was, I don't know how many people have seen it, but a little-known movie by Fassbinder, which was made for WDR called Life on a Wire, which dealt with kind of virtual, it's really a precursor of images of virtual forms of life. Strong, yeah, highly recommend it. But it made me think about how that work was also a precursor of interactive simulation, the Aspen movie map. So the sense of the two-dimensional view of the camera moving through the model is translated into the capturing of real camera imagery for the reassembly into an interactively navigable virtual environment. That's one of the first cases, and it happens just about, I think, about 5 years after the work that you're citing. And there's an interesting connection in the sense that the video imagery is navigational, right? And it sort of, in a sense, it sort of sets this paradigm of virtual reality navigation.
Completely, and there was a desire to have steering wheels and foot pedals which would allow the subjects to control the movement of the model. They were never able to quite achieve that because they didn't have the technological capacity to do so. But this was, interactivity was kind of key desire, key ambition of the project, which ultimately failed in a certain sense.
Like simulators?
Precisely, yes. Flight simulators, driving simulators.
This kind of reveals a sort of interesting subtheme of this desire for the navigable, you know, what becomes the navigable video environment, which is not really navigable, it's still a two-dimensional screen image, right?
It's interesting that you cite that video from past papers, and I didn't know about that, but I was wondering, I wanted to ask you a question about cybernetic systems theory in this regard, and specifically with regard to this video reference. Bateson has this model of agency that he articulates as an acrobat on a high wire, and he says that the acrobat is free to move within the conditions of the form to maintain the basic premise, that is, I'm walking on a high wire, and must work within the limitations of that premise, but is free to fall at any moment. And this becomes this metaphor for the propagation of control in society, that one is consistently constrained by the laws of power structures that are designed into a form. And at any point is free to step off and not participate and fall. And so I'm curious, like going even just this integration of architecture and psychology, I was curious where this sort of linking up of cybernetic principles come into play. Hibernate, to govern, the steering wheel. That is the Greek root of cybernetics, and so there's always this idea of control embedded.
Right, completely. This body of work emerges directly from cybernetic theory. Abstraction studied at MIT, worked with people like Nicholas Negroponte at MIT. He taught at MIT before coming to Berkeley in '69. And he brings with him an interest in cybernetics, which kind of takes on a different valence in the context of Berkeley and the projects in the region. But I think it's exactly this, the ability to kind of predict within a narrow range of possibility the actions of a subject in space. This is kind of a baseline necessity for the production of this research, one which I find interesting and kind of worth pushing against. But I see that in
media studies, it's really hard to track the relationship between observational technologies and technologies that are predictive, or technologies that are about simulating experience. And this is one of the few projects that I've seen where you can actually look at the interface between the observational, which would be more and the simulating, sort of providing new kinds of experiences. It's hard to track those two. And same very other educational systems using also television.
Right.
But they're strictly observational and not about producing types of experience. Although then they become types of experience with computing, but not with television.
that there's this kind of constant need in this work to work in both domains, because one modality kind of proves the validity of the other, and well, perhaps the simulation doesn't prove the validity of the real, but that the real produces the validity, the observation produces the validity of the simulator-based study. And this is kind of a constant tension in the work of these various architects, psychologists, and collaborators.
And a challenge for experimentation as well. That's exactly right. The shift in experimentation from object to simulation of it.
In terms of the experimental, so you mentioned in passing the testing ground, which seems to be a slightly sideways term, that it's not so much a thing as just to put on the table, because there seems to be a different kind of darkness to a testing ground than an experimental space, and it seems like that's something to just whether this is an experimental space or a space in which you could use test subjects, which is a very different, or maybe not very different, but there seems like a slightly
I'm also wondering about the subjectivity involved in the choice of this navigation, the choice that's being made in which to navigate around in that space and then simulate it out and observe in this that we moved into intelligence and relationship psychology and development, some together to real.
Thanks. Yes. I looked at other types of media apparatuses producing these different types of simulations, and so this is kind of one of the earlier ones. They're also full-scale slide-based simulators where slides are being projected at full scale. Subjects are kind of meant to feel as if they're in a kind of full-scale space. So we see the kind of progressive production of more elaborate simulator apparatuses, and then their kind of immediate dissolution into a return to studies based in the real thereafter. So this is kind of a hinge point in this longer historical trajectory. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Maria, do you want to just introduce yourself since you walked in late?
Yes, and I'm going to apologize so much. I live in the East Bay and then hit every unfortunate corner getting from traffic to delayed work to anything. So anytime, I really apologize. My name is Maria, and I just actually finished my PhD program at Berkeley in ethics studies and critical theory, and I work at the Center for Race and Gender, and I'm about to transition to working as an ACL scholar at Green's School.
And the folks in the water need to be considered.
Oh, yeah.
I'm Kelly Brown, I'm the Associate Director at ECHI with a PhD in Literature from UC Santos.
I'm Anirban. I'm a PhD student in visual studies in UCI and on staff with UCI.
I'm Shane Wilson. I'm a embedded grants officer at ECHI and a PhD in anthropology and history.
I'm Beth Green, I'm a research communications manager at ECHI, and I'm doing a PhD in history at UCI.
You all met James.
And Gabriella.
Where is it? Oh, she'll be back.
Okay, can I ask people to speak up a little bit? Sort of reveal
When we ask questions, when we interview.
Maybe we can put the microphone.
There's two microphones if you guys want to pass it around for questions.
That's right.
Those are for recording. This one and that one.
But if you just raise your question.
Yeah, maybe we put it in.
Yeah,
It
one
kind of
one
messes up
zero.
with the spontaneity.
Yeah, absolutely.
I forgot my question.
Just if you need it.
Okay, I guess we're going to move on to Melody, is our next presenter.
Oh, all right, so I'm here, guys. All right, so can you hear me okay from this?
Yes.
All right, so my work fits the parameter question quite well. I'm going to be talking about submergence underwater as an experimental strategy. So I first got started on this work in the ocean humanities back as a graduate student when I began watching New Planet, the documentary series in David Attenborough, and one of the scenes David Attenborough talks about how there's been more people in outer space than to the very bottom of the ocean. And he proceeded to describe a series of strange and wondrous creatures that you might even call alien. The picture above here is of a brine pool underwater. So this is an underwater hypersaline lake, and there's a hagfish that looks a bit phallic that's diving into the pool right now with a crust of I think they're mussels that are growing on the sort of sulfurous edge of the brine pool. So as he was talking about these strange creatures, we began to think about the ways in which my previous interest in science fiction so easily correlated with the ocean as itself a kind of science fictional space for estranging how we think about normative conditions of perception and normative conditions of speaking about the world. So here my work explicitly thinks through a strategy that I call milieu-specific theory to explore the consequences of a particular environment for the development of a critical vocabulary for talking about media or for other fields. Okay. So in these explorations, I turned to Jacques Cousteau. His book, The Silent World, is a really wonderful sort of phenomenological account of what it means to displace oneself in the ocean. So I think of submergence as a strategy as sort of like Archimedes with the bathtub, right? So you have an active displacement, you're immersing yourself in a new environment. So this really asks a question about both environment and perceiver. So who is the knowing being and in what environmental conditions? And so Cousteau has this really wonderful formulation. From this day forward, we would swim across the miles of country no man had known, free and level, with our flesh feeling what the fish scales know. And so as a literary scholar, among other things, this phrase, feeling what the fish scales know, really stood out to me as a way of merging aesthetically both the registers of touch and knowledge in a particular way. What does it mean to inhabit the world? Or what does it mean for fish scales to have a kind of haptic or tactile knowledge about the ocean? Why does embodiment matter? And what kind of orientation might the fish or might the perceiver have to the world? So how does the environment shape that orientation or condition that orientation? So for me, this registers with contemporary work by Sarah Ahmed. Her essay, Orientations Matter, makes one key observation. So she talks about repetitive strain injury and also the way that tables gather you in certain kinds of alignments. And as someone who types a lot and had to go through some back physical therapy, you all kind of know about the alignments that our habits align ourselves in. So she says our body takes the shape of this repetition. We get stuck in certain alignments as an effect of this work. Bodies hence acquire orientation through the repetitions of some actions over others. And so as part of this work on thinking through submergence in the ocean, I underwent several stages of scuba diving training. And this is a photograph that I took inside a shipwreck. And I was very attentive as I was learning to what were my habits that I had to unlearn to become a good diver. And one of them has to do with the tendency to want to stand up instead of be horizontal whenever something bad happens or whenever I feel out of control. Feeling out of control means flipping up and standing up, and this is a habit consistent among new divers, whereas the proper posture is to maintain a nice horizontal glide. But one of the other challenges in diving is thinking about air as a kind of technology. You have to breathe it, you use how much you inhale will make you sort of rise up, exhaling makes you sink a little bit, and you also have to maintain a bubble around you of air in your vest. So there's all these different kinds of orientational conditions that diving physically, I guess you could say, disciplines the body to respond to. And I also became interested in what happens when you rethink terminology in media theory in the context of the ocean. So this has both literary sensibility to it and media sensibility. With this particular photograph, I think about inscription.
So if inscription is a key term that comes up a lot in discourses of media, what happens when you think about is conditions of inscription underwater? The shipwreck is preserved, but what remains? Does writing hold up underwater? Do marks hold up underwater? Or do you have to shift your vocabulary to something more along the lines of saturation or residue? What does it mean to think about the residue of the liquid as an alternative to discussions of inscription? So another key term I think about is database. What happens when you think of the C as a kind of archive or historical museum? So this is my photograph of Jason DeCara-Taylor's underwater museum in Mexico. And his photographs of these sculptures all tend to have a kind of frontality to them. You look at their faces, whereas mine, as I was experiencing the sculptures, was sort of more of a fish or bird's eye view overhead, collected in this way. But with the database, I think of instead of the integrity of individual bits of data that don't degrade through time, even though there's conventional ways of talking about seas of data or flows of information, underwater, I think that cultivating an archive is more appropriate to the conditions of water as both a gestative medium and also something that erodes over time. So from a mathematical equation, think about Boyle's law, where the interface is not a surface, but if the lung is a kind of interface, then it's that which mediates between air breathed and also the saturation of air in body tissues. And so part of what matters underwater is thinking about interface, the duration of a distributed volume of the interface. The interface is your full body rather than simply the surface. And finally, I'm interested in the underwater cabinet meeting from the Maldives in 2009. This is a way where you can channel submergence as a political tactical strategy for making particular arguments about the effects of sea level rise and climate change. So I think of my work on submergence as kind of pre-activist, but what would make it applied or a version of praxis would be how do you brainstorm moments where submergence can be a kind of political strategy for talking about survival in Anthropocene.
In the process of developing this vocabulary towards a new ethics, possibly, how do you think about this idea of feeling what the fish scales feel in relationship to the human as a particular embodied receptor of information that, as a result, produces a particular ethics in relationship to fish scales too, that there might be a limit to what humans can speculate fish scales might do, and still do this really important thinking of how to think in ethics that expands beyond that human limitation.
Okay, so I think I can answer this in terms of another project I'm involved with, which is on the topic of ocean memory. So this is a scientific and artistic working group that I've been working on writing a science paper with to think about what does it mean to say an ocean has memory. Is this stored in microbes? Is this stored in, say, whale song or other kinds of distributed networks? And furthermore, one question you can ask from that is, where are our areas of ocean memory particularly sensitive? Or where does the ocean have amnesia? Where is memory loss taking place due to anthropogenic activities? So there could be a direction here where ethics also has to do with thinking about careful areas of treatment, like where might human actions be disruptive?
A follow-up to that one, I was just thinking when you were talking about chasing corals, and I'm not a scuba diver, but I'm a snorkeler, and I love snorkels, and you've seen chasing corals, so you know what's happening. So I was thinking about this relationship, flesh feeding, fish don't know, questions around the post-human, you know, and kind of the intervention you were talking about in terms of an environmental ethics. And so I'm just wondering how those sort of things come together in terms of this particular project. I mean, you talk about, you know, the Project Ocean Memory, but at the same time, that's kind of like documenting, sort of like chasing for what's happening. But I'm wondering how we can kind of go beyond and make an intervention into those spaces.
So I'm glad to bring up the film Chasing Coral, and I have strong feelings about this. So I think that it's a really fascinating film to think about in the history of feminist science studies and discussions of objectivity, because what happens in this film is it ends up shifting its protagonist from this sort of ad man, or someone who's trained in the ad industry, to this coral nerd who is an engineer. And he has fish tanks that only have coral. No fish, just coral. That's how much he really loves them. And it goes from it's really chronicling the attempt to create this underwater camera that will take time-lapse photographs of the coral reef as it experiences, what is it? It's from heat. Coral bleaching, thank you. As it's bleaching over time, and time after time they continue to fail. And then finally, the only thing they have left to rely on is physical documentation, where they're diving multiple times a day and so doing time-lapse photography by hand. And in this one scene, you see the guy who's the coral nerd, going up to the reef and just fondling the disintegrating corals. And that's when he has his most moving moment, is when he goes and touches them. And so it's a really interesting sort of trajectory from trying to set up the technology for distant observation to going back to touch as a kind of method of being emotionally moved. And I just think that and then after that he ends up having a tour bus where he goes in and he gives lectures to schools about what he saw. So I think one of the ethical questions is, what does it mean to be touched, and what does it mean to touch at a proximity, or how do media like documentary film like this still manage to touch or dramatize a kind of touching at a distance somehow through the experience of someone in proximity who was a witness.
What it is to have a kind of environmental necropolitics.
Yeah.
Right in the moment.
This kind of actually reminded me of another movie, which is The Shape of Water, which was heralded in some circles as a form of queer cinema, which was interesting to me, and that it was engaging with fishiness and like transcending the human as a form of queerness, which is kind of funny and very much romanticized this idea that like, and I love how you talk about this, like the ocean as a form of alternative sky, that this god that they called him in the movie was emerging from the depths of the water rather than descending from heaven. And it kind of brings it, so you were talking about, I love this idea, it sounds almost like an oblique strategy card, like submerge yourself. But this idea of like venturing into the water, going and touching the water, but the thing is, unlike venturing into space, the water is coming for us. Like it is rising to meet us. And it's not necessarily something that we will have agency in. And I wonder what you make of that impending touching and how we should engage it, because it's different than like preservation and awareness of our impact there. I don't know, maybe it's not.
One question that comes up a lot is what's the relationship between oceans and frontiers? So some discussion by someone like Gary Kroll would say that a lot of ocean exploration is all about domesticating the ocean. So it's a little bit tricky, like, is the ocean a space that, as we get to know it, becomes a space of domestication? You see this a lot in Cousteau films, especially some of the later ones, where he's trying to create these underwater habitats that people can live in, and they happen to look an awful lot like spaceships or like sort of architectures we already have. So that's a strange case of assimilation, but that's different from allowing the ocean to exist like on its own terms and trying to comport to the conditions that exist there. And then it also depends what body you have. I mean, one thing I'm really aware of with scuba is just the fact that I don't have asthma, so I can do it. If you do have asthma, it's really dangerous and you can't. So there's a sort of underlying also like disabilities discourse that goes here, both with the ability to dive and then also the way that diving does alleviate conditions of gravity. So for some people who've experienced injury, it's really quite free. So there's a whole program, not exactly a program, but there's a lot of instances where like military veterans will be taken on dives, especially if they've had limbs amputated or other things. I've seen this when I was doing diving training too. They'll take them out to do a dive, and then all of a sudden movement's restored. So
yeah. Sorry, may I ask one? I guess I just mean like as the sea level rises to meet us, it's our obligation to, I guess that's what I mean by it. Is it like we need to learn how to touch this water and live with it? Or is it like it is our obligation to retreat and give the water its space? Like how do we negotiate that feeling divide?
It depends on where you live and what your cultural presuppositions are.
I just have
Sure.
Actually, just to build on the last few questions, and I'm just so enamored with the presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, it's just fabulous. I wanted to actually relate it to the idea of what bodies go into the water and what's the purpose. Is it to domesticate it or is it to find out what the body is capable of in the water? You mentioned something about politics, and it's really just a clarification question because you ended your presentation with this idea of kind of politics of subversion. And I wanted to know what you meant by that in relation to the earlier question about what like an anthropos or like an anthropocentric idea of what fish can do, for example, means when you're thinking about a politics of subversion, but also what you mean by politics of subversion when you're talking about, for example, some bodies can do it perhaps with a witness or in relation to some bodies that can't, and you know, like what that looks like to you, or if you could just elaborate.
So I think that submergence has to be, I think it has to be a culturally specific strategy or tactic. And in the case of the melodies here, and the thing I was sort of wrapping it quickly, I didn't have time to mention is that, so this is the president of the Maldives here, but he had his entire cabinet undergoes some scuba training so that they can all sign this document to become carbon neutral by a certain date. I mean, and since he's been kicked out of office and but plans to run again, and he's been a huge activist for climate change and bringing attention to the fate of small island nations. So why I feel like this sort of caps off. So my research question started off as being speculative, but here I see a really fascinating application where the tactic of, this is a science fiction, this is the future of the Maldives, right? What he's showing us. If he's showing us a future in order to defer it. So if the fiction works, this will not happen, but it's probably going to happen. But it's still, I think, a really sharp science fictional tactic for trying to get across a message about political change. So here, it's not only about the ocean. Here, the tactic is using the ocean to talk about land loss. But that doesn't mean that every element is separate. They're always shifting, moving all the time. And so I don't think of land, sea, sky necessarily in sort of a trialectic, in trialectic isolation. And in fact, no other national ocean and atmospheric agency is all about the ocean atmospheric system and exchanges on whole too.
Is that meant to be ambiguous or is that meant to frighten?
I think it's meant to reduce global reliance on oil. And it's meant to, I think it's
carbon emissions.
to reduce carbon emissions. But there's been a lot of work by alliances of Pacific Island states to sort of coordinate efforts to bring awareness to sea level rise.
I think it's something like a 2-foot sea rise will completely submerge the non-dives. Something like 300,000 people. Something.
But her question was, should we welcome that or should we retreat? And this seems to be doing both.
So French Polynesia has signed an agreement with a Silicon Valley tech company right now to experiment with floating island architectures. And I don't know how it's going to go because they're really libertarian and French Polynesia just gave them space to experiment. But nonetheless, they share a common interest in trying to think about how would you create new architectures for living at sea, which has some sort of unworked out legal implications because these island nations, there's the loss of land question, but there's also the question of their historical fishing rights based on how many miles offshore they are from land. So if you're not physically present in your nation, can you still have these fishing rights? Totally up for debate. There's not been a case on this yet, but the question of to retreat or not is being actively explored. Where it's like the question of could you live on these floating islands? But then that gets more complicated because there's an issue of dependency too. How much debt are you going to go into as a small island nation trying to buy a new island, and who's going to maintain it too? Part of it's a problem. So it's really gets.
Can I just say something about that?
Yeah.
I spent some time in the Pacific recently, and I'm quite focused on these questions of sea level rise and sustainability. One of the issues is not just losing land. A really crucial issue is the salination of freshwater reserves. And it only takes 2 inundations of an island freshwater aquifer for it to be unusable for drinking or agriculture. So you only need 2 storms a year. You only need 2 big waves a year to make a vast number of islands completely uninhabitable. So the question of whether you're floating islands or not doesn't really help much unless you've got some enormously sophisticated, solid freshwater desalination system. But that's a little off topic.
Sorry, that's the next question for you. So I was thinking about the politics of submergence in 2 ways, and this question that was raised about, so what do we do? Do we just embrace the touching of the water as inevitable? And I was thinking about the we and who the politics of submergence is for, in reflecting on this presentation I saw last summer on islands in Melanesia that have pretty much zero hope of not being submerged already. There's no way. Like even if we halted all carbon emissions now, it's too late. And yet there's this different kind of politics coming out of those spaces of how do you fight for what you know you can't have, which is your history, your land, right, your monuments, everything that will go with the island. And so is the politics of submersion for them? I don't think so, right? Or maybe, we can draw an analogy here, but it's not about loss of land, it's about loss of everything. And then the second thing I was thinking about, and you can respond however you want, is how in a lot of the art, there's this kind of merging of art and data in climate science right now, and part of it is how do you communicate the data in a way that's going to move people to do something. And it seems often that it's about escaping the conventionality of the senses that we use to perceive it. And so, for example, sound data. Like you can hear the change in an ecosystem over time if someone's been recording it as a result of climate change. That seems to move people. Whereas looking at data and dates and times doesn't. So I was wondering if either of these two bring anything on you.
Oh, that's interesting. But can you remember the first point?
The first point was who are the politics of submergence for? The people whose islands are already doomed, or people who need to be moved to do work to stop further submergence.
Yeah, okay, so one of the things I think, one of the tendencies that exists within climate change, art, fiction, and it is that it tends to be constrained to the instrumental. Like, you want the art to do something, or you want the movement to do something, or sort of directed to either broader awareness or something else. But one of the things that I like about this underwater cabinet meeting is that there's sort of a poetic resonance to it that leaves you with something that is more than just reduce carbon emissions. So I think that one horizon for effective strategy is when it doesn't sort of hitch too much to a particular policy, even though that's what needs to happen. So it's a hard thing, but it's easy to reduce climate change art just in the instrumental, and there's something a little bit lost there. And then your second question was about data.
About how we have to challenge people's senses or how they understand data, and this often involves art practice together with scientific practice to get people to feel the urgency of climate change, because the data alone doesn't seem to, or presented in conventional ways doesn't seem to do it. Yeah, people can see all the information available and still.
It's such a big problem. I mean, because you also have to think about who your audience is and where you're going to meet them and what's going to resonate. And are you preaching to the choir? Are you going to give a talk? I mean, I went to South Carolina recently to give a talk on the artificial island material, and I realized that the claim I was trying to make about the importance of historical architectures, like how could you use sort of traditional architectural methods to inform these new floating islands so that they're not just sort of science fictional, architectures from the West, but like how could you use Pacific architectures to think about future island design? That was going to resonate really differently in Charleston, South Carolina, than other places where the history of slavery has a not so subtle footprint on the entire space there. So I found myself really having to think about the audience question. So I think that for all this, it's key to think about specific audiences, even though this particular piece of media, I think, did travel very well.
Can we have one more question? So I'm also from one of the coastal campuses, and I'm on a number of PhD committees in the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And one of the biggest challenges that I face as somebody who comes from media studies and visual practice is working against the tendency to think that when you're beginning to incorporate art practice or visual techniques, as you're doing as someone who's a scholar with a degree in English, with camera, underwater, how do you do immersive research? But what are the questions around experimentation with technology that come in your practice, and what is your charge? So what I find with the SIO PhD students is that their practices are bifurcated. So on the one hand, they're using these incredible digital arrays of GoPro type cameras to image face down the coral, the bleaching process in the coral reef, and they leave the cameras there. And on the other hand, they don't use that footage in their films, which they're encouraged to make these films that are public presentations that will educate the public and make the public feel really emotional. And I have strong concerns about the humanist direction of the filmic turn in public education versus the much more interesting capacity of the research materials to turn toward a different approach to understanding reflexively knowledge practices in the humanities. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your use of cameras. And how you think through experimentation in your practice,
So I had to think about the question, so to go with Jakob von Bushkel's theory of Umwelt, or what is the character of an animal's perceptual world, what's the difference between the camera's Umwelt and yours as an eye? So you can think about the mobility of lenses and where the eye is situated. And I also think another perceptual question you can ask is about synesthesia. So if you start looking into the biology of aquatic organisms, many of them cross senses that we wouldn't even think to. So for example, crabs taste with their feet. What would it mean to develop a vocabulary about what it's like to taste through touch? Or dolphins being the more popular one, what does it mean to see with sound? And so there's a whole direction you can go there that sort of breaks you out of what are the normal or normative conception, or parameters of perception, and could a documentary film subvert those in the way that it plays with sound or vision in some way? Could it try to translate sight to you? Could it try to translate something else to you? What would it mean to design a documentary meant to be experienced by, say, another creature rather than a human being? You can ask all these kind of speculative questions all around the question of sensory perception and synesthesia, I think. And someone who does that, not exactly that, but starts to break that down a little bit better is Schaffzin, so French film. So I like to teach with his films because they're so over the top that it makes the students think like, oh, this is not Blue Planet. I'm not receiving the message. I'm suddenly very, very aware of myself as a viewer.
Just before you move on, I'm glad you posed the question, because as you were talking, I was thinking about the implication for perception of experimentation. And so there are at least three different sort of conceptions that seem to be floating at this point. I mean, one is experimentation in that that very conventional sense. When you, I think it was Micronesia when you said the neoliberalization of the undertaking, right? Where there's almost a predetermination of the outcome. So you know the outcome you're out to produce through the experiments that you're going to. You could even not do the experiment and you'll still have the same outcome.
Yeah.
Effectively. The second would be a kind of being open to not knowing what the outcome is, right? I mean, in a way, a slightly more experimental, conventional understanding of experimentation, so to speak. And then there's the kind of experimentation as a kind of almost an unexpectation or disexpectation, right? Which is partly, I think, at least what you were driving at, sort of in the last element of your point. So putting that, in the way community was sort of putting resources to work outside the given or expected or usual prescribed use, right? A way of really opening up to almost to impossibility, right? I mean, to possibilizing the impossible in some ways. And that's strikes me as a different kind or a different notion of experimentation than these other solutions. And there's no doubt others as well.
Yeah, this was good said that, you brought up, it was a wonderful presentation, but you brought up so many interesting concepts that we throw around in humanities without thinking very much about inscription. We just talked about the inscription model of gender in my class yesterday. Inscription history, temporality, instead of things like brain that you suggest residue and submergence. And I'm wondering what kind of cultural theory we would have. What would cultural theory look like? What would epistemology look like? How would we do gender theory differently? What would our conception of history? And it just seems like an opportunity to rethink all the humanities through the lens you present.
That's
It's kind of connected, so I feel like I just want to jump in because this isn't coherent, but I've been thinking this, and when you said it, so much of this, the genre within which your work is kind of falling leans on emergence, that I find submergence as really interesting. So not to become, but to kind of retreat into. And that's seems like a different politics of life as well, which isn't vitalist in that kind of things are just sprouting up and just kind of going under.
So,
but not in a purely necropolitical sense.
So that's interesting you mentioned out in and under, because what I didn't get to this presentation is one chapter takes a lot of concern with prepositions. So what happens when you change your prepositions? Rather than thinking about generally only critical nouns or even verbs sometimes as something to think with. But if you go for the preposition instead, in, out, under, through, down, up, this is what the ocean gets you to think about. And so one of the fables that I discuss is Willem Boozer's Vampire Squid text, Vampire to business pronouns. And there's a good section in there that has to do with the way the vampire squid would orient its world. Up wouldn't be positive necessarily, down might take on a different connotation, so a lot of our orientations are tagged to sort of a terrestrial values, way of valuing things based on what conditions are good for us. So another implication of the theory then is to think through the prepositions.
So I think we should move on.
Yeah, for time.
And our next speaker is Dorothy.
I probably have the least amount, actually, of images. So hopefully this will garner some good discussion. So I should probably preface everything because prior to returning to academia, I was actually in biotech, pharmaceutical, close to 14 years.
And I was explaining yesterday at dinner how when you get so used, or maybe here today, when you get so used to the language of experimentation, and I'm actually looking at first, at the start of my presentation, quite literally at experimentation through pharmaceutical, through biotech. And I originally started off as like a psych philosophy undergrad. I begged my mom to send me to art school. She should have just sent me to art school. And then I got my master's in visual and critical studies, and that's where I kind of first really realized that I wanted to experiment with, I wanted to stay away from scientific language at first because I was just so immersed in it with my day job. And then when I graduated from the master's in visual and critical studies from California College of the Arts, I started to look more exclusively at artists exploring scientific methodologies such as DNA phenotyping, gene editing, regenerative medicine, precision medicine, but within their artistic practice. And I thought to myself, well, I could probably create something from all of this research, and decided to go the route of creative writing, speculative fiction, science fiction, and started developing work. Hopefully it's okay to put Maya on the spot. And looking at kind of all the things I've learned in these close to 14 years of working within biotech, and how to use language, scientific language differently. And so maybe I should just start off with the question that I am asking with my own creative work, in addition to my research through the program of Film and Visual Media at Santa Cruz, which is how might we trouble the language of Western scientific language used in clinical research, but also how might we create new ways of including queer, trans, and gender non-conforming bodies. And I ask that because, asking one of my managers when I was, full disclosure, I used to work at Genentech and Gilead, if anyone's interested. And no, I didn't bill for anything, but for research purposes. But I asked the manager who I was working with, she had experience for over 20 years in clinical research, and I said, what if someone who's trans-identified wanted to be a part of our study? And she just looked incredibly dumbfounded and said, I've never run across that. I don't know what you mean. I mean, that's literally what she said. I don't know what you mean by that. What do you mean by a trans individual being interested in being a part of our study? And I said, but the human body comes, yes, in all shapes and sizes, but whether you're on concomitant medications, being hormones or anything, any kind of medication that might cure or prevent symptoms of an illness is not for a body other than the binary, other than a male, cisgender female body or bodies. So that's what I started to explore in my own writing. And yes, citations, I took kind of like, a little creative license here, but I looked at domain errors pretty heavily because the Sabrosa Collective, who produced this book, Domain Errors, was looking at eugenics and biotechnology and surveillance in a way that I kind of wanted to incorporate into my own practice of writing. And I've been producing work for the past couple of quarters, so again, I'm a first year, and really thinking about game mechanics as well. So instead of something wholly interactive, meaning there's this ludic experience of a player playing through my text, it's kind of like choose your own adventure. There's no real incentive into playing my games, quote unquote. And I'm using domain errors as a way of exploring that. And I'm working on a piece right now that is inspired by their practices. But I also use the UFO group as inspiration for how I might explore troubling that language, that scientific language. Because I think there's such rigidity in, clearly, obviously so, because you're, being in biotech, you're governed by the Food and Drug Administration, so you have to, follow certain rules and regulations. But this was a way for me to explore how I might tell a particular story in 99 different ways. And so that's one of the things that I was thinking about. I also thought that I might explain, and I'll get to my project, but what I brought today, the common terminology criteria for adverse events, this is actually produced by the National Institute of Health, and it's a way for, and again, this is just to contextualize what I'm going to present next, or my current work. is there is an actual index for how we look at adverse events that happen in clinical research. So if someone, and this is really interesting because in the creative work I've been doing, I take some of these adverse events or syndromes or disorders, and I have created and written about characters, or even just thinking about humans, that some of these adverse events actually become natural. So for example, if you, right now an adverse event in clinical trial might be polyneuropathy. So if you're taking a particular drug and you experience tingling in your feet and your hands, that's considered an adverse event. May or may not be related to the drug or medication that you're on. But in the stories that I'm writing, polyneuropathy becomes a human, part of the human condition for the sake of feeling the earth in a completely different way. I know that sounds so sentimental, but that's kind of where I'm coming from in this sense. Okay, wow, so anyway, so this is really short actually. I literally have 3 slides. So what I'm doing for my creative work in my project is I'm taking protocols that, these are really standard protocols that are used by biotech, by the biotech industry, and I am creating prose and poetics, but in this form. And looking at, again, something very, I'm playing with this idea of this tromboy. So you look at it, it looks very scientific, there's a type of verisimilitude that you're expecting, but when you look at my version of the study assessments or the study visits, it won't look like this. Like, you have to look very carefully, you have to read exactly what assessment my particular subject for my trial would be subjected to. So one of the experiments I'm writing is, and someone gave this to me, is, the primary endpoint for one of my studies would be how to successfully CRISPR toxic masculinity out of cisgender men. But that's a primary endpoint. So then what I'm doing is I'm creating a whole protocol based on meeting this primary endpoint with specific references to cultural. So I'm looking at cultural disease as well, and kind of popular kind of medications that might be associated with that. And then so my mathematical language and symbol is again pulling from UFO and saying to myself, well, if they can use a dictionary, maybe I can use scientific text to then play around with changing around the subjects in my writing, and then finding the 7th letter down, or the 7th word down from, like a medical text or a nurse's surgical manual. So those are the types of references that I'm using to kind of as part of my creative practice.
You have a minute left.
Okay, I can start. So as you were talking, I was wondering about perhaps the role of camouflage or passing that relates to your experiments with scientific forms, and what intention you might have for them to have this as a kind of like the veracity of the form as a kind of camouflage in order to do what they want to do.
Yeah, no, I really love that idea, and yes? Gabi and I were talking about that as well, and there's this, I actually created a pain index for artists a couple of years ago, and it's extremely satirical because the appendices have these strategies that are basically very be kind of, practices that someone could take to reduce the pain of a non-creative, stagnant, state of, or like, are you stagnant in your creative process? And then, but it's using the pain indices for that, which was developed by Charles Cleveland, whose whole research was on pain, but specifically looking at cancer patients. But it's camouflaged in that, so you have to read it very carefully, and then you find yourself kind of laughing, at the end. But because it looks like form, it looks just like a pain index. So
I like that you connect humor to that too. So maybe satire has always had an element of camouflage in it as well.
Exactly.
Like pass through and like the recognition of, oh, that's not it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Totally. Thank you.
How are you using gendered language in your work? Thinking also about I don't know, when you brought up the logo, it reminded me of the Sphinx and the idea of not using gendered language at all. How are you thinking about attacking this?
Well, I'm still playing around with that and whether I want to include that or not, because most scientific language actually is devoid of that. And so that's, do I want to stay with that? Or do I want to trouble it and then use different types of pronouns? Because I also don't want, because I do identify as queer, so I wouldn't want to read something that does that kind of misinterprets or that could lead to misinterpretation or a misunderstanding. I want to be really respectful of that. So I'm still actually grappling with that. But thank you for bringing that up because I have thought about that.
It seems interesting because the misunderstanding. So I was listening to you and thinking of Gabi, because there's a reversal there, where there's an attempt to normalize and to do this thing where you kind of produce these normalized subjects. And in turning the adverse effect into the condition, it's not a denormalize, it's a kind of messing with the parameters. And so when I'm hearing you, I want to say that don't be respectful of the thing to some extent, not in the political sense, but in the sense that part of the thing is also to undo the thing that you respect, right? Like not to kind of re-instantiate it somehow. And I don't know quite what to do with that, but it seems like there's something there which is like the flip side of the mechanism that Gabi was going to talk about in the sentence. And probably concurrent in some sense, like in coordinate to that be interesting parallels between the medical science trajectories and this.
There's this logic, with the most to create poetry or justifications, and also in your protocols that you research. I wonder if it also seems like a protocol to me is like this logic tree that we go to the next, and how does that maybe play with the rules can interject into this given system approach and evolve.
No, thank you for that. Just a comment to your comment I'm also using media that's very commonly used in clinical research. So for many, many years, interactive voice response systems were used to collect data. So I was actually thinking of creating an interactive media component to the protocols, because there will be physical lab manuals that I'm creating, but there would be a phone tree where someone would call in and either learn more about the study that they're participating in, or they would enter in some type of data as well. And that becomes kind of a tree in and of itself, it's a logic, but it's when something kind of starts to press the numbers to go to different parts of this tree, this phone tree, it starts to become illogical. So I am definitely playing around with logic to become illogical almost.
Your example of trans, your question, that you asked about trans identify, how does that fit into the tree? I think since approvals from all the experience. Thank you.
We may be on time.
Yes.
Something about that, by the way. We get to get into some time for Q&A for the applied support. So I'm actually a keynote. Thank you.
I thought you said you were the keynote.
That's me. All right, everybody settle down. We got time to keep it. All right, so, click it. Sorry, no worries. It's right here. So I begin with an image. In 1964, the visual analog scale for pain measurement was developed by Michael Bond and Issy Pulaski. It was simple, a 10-centimeter long line. I have no pain at all on the leftmost side. My pain is as bad as it could possibly be on the rightmost side. The mark made by the patient corresponded to the physical measurement, 0 centimeters to 10 centimeters, and that value was recorded. Since the advent of the VAS, there have been a plethora of advancements, the most recognizable of which is the Walker-Baker Faces scale, a familiar six-step scale designed with illustrated faces, each expressing a higher level of suffering as one moves from left to right. The scale was designed by Donna Wong and Connie Baker in the mid-1980s while working in a pediatric bird unit at Hillcrest Medical Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma. These quantitative graphic tools are now in widespread use for the mediation of caregiver-patient communication, ways for two interlocutors to come to an understanding using a common scale. If you've ever gone to the ER, or done physical therapy, or complained of any sort of pain to a medical practitioner, you've most likely been asked to rate that pain on a scale of 1 to 10. You may also be asked to fill out a pain diagram seen here. If, as the prompt to today's presentation suggested, a citation is about the translation from one's words to another's words, then we must consider the dialogue between caretaker and patient to be citable. How much does it hurt, the doctor asks. What I say to him next will affect how he treats me, how he diagnoses me, where he looks, how closely he does so, what he suggests I do, what sorts of care or treatment to which I get access. Along the way, he, and I use he for my own personal experiences, will continue to cite my answer until I have a new one. In her 1985 The Body in Pain, philosopher Elaine Scarry writes of the relationship between a feeling and expression of pain. Using torture subjects as a primary study, she suggests that when, quote, the sentient fact of a person's suffering, unquote, are lifted into the visible world, that is, when subjects scream, bleed, or otherwise convey their suffering, the torturer has successfully objectified his subject's body. He is now in control. Scary's torturers, be they actual pain-inflicting individuals or metaphorically arbiters of a central ideology or cultural construct, the torturers translate the intangible into the tangible, forcing its reconstruction in the sheer material factualness of the human body, borrowed to lend that cultural construct the aura of realness and certainty. I'd like to suggest that the images used to mediate communication between caretaker and patient are forced to produce a translation from the subjective pain to the objective data. And in doing so, they turn the subject into object. What does the object look like to these systems? These systems of mediation then? The object becomes a symbol, perhaps placed on a mathematically governed plot that determines its normalcy. Or perhaps the object looks more colorful, is stacked in multiple dimensions, providing a sort of visual cheat sheet to its condition. This is a screenshot from the pain tracking app called Catch My Pain. It's a chart that I would argue embodies both image and symbol. What then, if we took the data purported to make up this object and repurposed it, might the object turn back into subject? Might the subject reclaim something? To this point, I've been referencing my research and writing practice situated in design history and STS. What follows is from my art practice. But what joins the two is the argument that there is authorship in quantitative systems, an authorship that quite often goes unsighted. This is the Fitbit Flex. It's the lowest end device sold by the Fitbit company, and it is purported to keep track of how many steps you take during the day, the intensity with which you take them, and when you've taken them. This is done using a MEMS3 accelerometer chip, a small piece of silicone, plastic, and copper that senses movement. This data is encrypted as base 16 hexadecimal values and transmitted via low-power wireless technology to your computer or smartphone, wherein software written by developers at Fitbit decrypt the hex into base 10 values that correspond to steps taken by date and intensity. The output is this dashboard we see here, arranged by Fitbit designers. Each of these translations happen in a matter of a fraction of a second with the help of proprietary algorithms programmed by Fitbit developers, whom we might identify as the authors of this dashboard. But the developers are only one piece of the process. Along the way, they are most likely, directly or indirectly, incorporating input from salespeople, designers, executives, shareholders, kinesiologists, engineers, manufacturers, and others. Also, in case you're interested, Fitbit has like 150 open positions right now, 55 of which are in California, so academia's not working out for you. Looking at this, I think about a 2012 work by Andrew Gabi and Matthew Fuller called Evil Media. In the book, the authors use this concept of grayness, that a quality that is easily overlooked, and that is what gives its great attraction, an unremarkableness that can be of inestimable value in background operations. Within the Fitbit example, then, there are many instances of grayness, from the lines and lines of hexadecimal values to the probably overwhelming lines of code written by the developers to encode, encrypt, decrypt, and decode. In looking at the raw data and reading Fuller and Gabi, I recognize that this grayness is something very familiar across any computer script or program, and what we're dealing with here is just text values. It's really how basically anything on your computer is stored. So I took the data, put it through a bit of my own translations, and created these pieces of output. This is an image wherein the text values are color data. This is a, thank you. This is a 3D print where X, Y, and Z values correspond to the data. We also made sounds and animations out of the data that I don't have time to show here. Tying this all together, I started with images that mediate the collection of biometric data, that is, the answers to how severe and where is your pain. These are tools designed to quantify the subject. For a scary, this has an objectifying effect. What's important here, however, is that this translation happens through a symbolic system that leaves no trail of citations. There are further implications here, of course, but if I spent my time talking about neoliberal biopolitics, holding incrementality, and artificiality of biomedical thresholds, I would really be completing the assignment, and as our students remind us regularly, we must stick to the assignment. Thank you very much.
May I start?
Please.
Yeah, well, I think that the project also, there's like it's temporal, because this type of technology, granted I have a Fitbit right now, is going to at some point become like almost like an archaeological like object of study versus something that is like, can tell us currently what, our bodies are doing, and it might even cease to do that. So have you factored in what that might look like in future research? Or is like and I guess what I'm saying is, when thinking about this output that you've produced, like the color data and of that nature, like have you factored that in, that the obsolescence of the object?
So the question is basically when Fitbit's not around in 5 years or so, right? Yeah, and that's where I think a lot of my research has turned to sort of the history of visualized quantified pain and the measurement of pain, and also sort of a scientific turn in design and medical sciences, so that I'm not sort of tied to an object that is obsolete in a number of years. At the same time, I think the questions of both planned obsolescence and also the collection of this data, where does it exist, when does it exist, are certainly fascinating.
And I would finish off by saying, have you looked at, I forgot which video game console, but it was Biorhythms. I want to say it was Biorhythms. You might be interested in looking at it, because speaking of the whole kind of platform discussion, that might be of interest to you.
It's kind of in response to that question, Dorothy. It's funny that, like, the thing that I kept thinking about during your presentation was the invention of the stethoscope, and how that was a medium. Initially doctors were just asking, you were the only way a doctor would understand what's going on in your body, and then suddenly the stethoscope allowed the doctor to bypass the person and just listen to the body, and the patient was not in control of their own pain. And now the stethoscope isn't really used anymore as the tool it was intended to, but it functions as a signifier. And actually it allows the doctor to touch the patient, and it allows for this moment of interaction. And it brings me back to the Fitbit, because in a way, to play devil's advocate, like, it does make people in charge of their data. They're not just asking the doctor or the nurse practitioner to punch all the numbers into whatever Epic or the system they use and say, like, well, tell me, what does this mean? Like, in some way, maybe it is empowering, and I wonder if maybe in the future of Fitbit, like, that will just be a little, some symbol, some tool in that way. I don't know. Or is that naive to think about it that way?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that I would counter that you walking and holding it and having a Fitbit on your wrist is effectively the same as you telling your nurse or doctor, I moved my leg, I moved my leg, I moved my leg, and the nurse or doctor entering really whatever they want into their system, what they understood you moving your leg to be. You don't see that translation happen. You don't get access to any sort of raw data. What I showed up there is completely encrypted. There's no way for me to understand what it recorded. And so I think that if anything, you're quite hidden from it, but the language around it, the marketing language, the discourse around the device is empowering, and I think dangerously so.
That's why I really
like, I'm sure you know Tika Brains or Yamantu's project about Fitbits, where they came up with all these different ways to strap Fitbits to metronomes and drills and steps, right, as a sort of way to hack the system. And so I taught a class this semester called Technology, Choreography, and Embodiment about the quantified self-movement, about the ways in which you might look at how these tools are actually choreographing your movements. So, when people wear Fitbits, do they swing their arms extra strong to be like, yes, it's a step? And how, we're looking at these translations of data, because your work is taking data and translating it into 3D prints or translating it into fields of color. And I mean, you made this point that the subject becomes an object via these images. And one of the things I'm curious about is how far does that go? Right? Do I become an object by virtue of this image in front of me? Would that only happen if there were many of those in front of me? So where does that process start? Where does it end? Does it only happen if it's being used by a corporation to advertise to me? So I'm curious your thoughts on that as someone who is working on this.
Right. Yes, that's an excellent point, and an excellent question. To your first point, I think that one of the ways I got into this project was because of the way that Fitbits come pre-programmed, right, to reward 10,000 steps in a day, 5 miles a day, which can be extremely damaging to some and extremely dangerous to others. And so that's why the bell curve goes up there, right? That's sort of what governs that. As for the question of what are the limits of being objectified, I think Scary is speaking so much in the context of the vulnerable, and so I see the pained and patient in a position of vulnerability, especially sitting on a doctor's table versus having the stethoscope around one's neck. I think that creates a relationship, and so I think that the objectification sort of is exacerbated by the vulnerability of the patient. Is that sort of addressing the question? I don't know. Is there a limit to being objectified? I don't know. That's the best answer I can give you at this point. Maybe we'll find it one day.
So, I mean, what would a history of experimentation look like, told from a history of the objects of experimentation?
Nice one. Yeah.
I hope you're not really asking that.
Well, it made me think, can I just interrupt, because on the matter of instrumentation, it made me think of Georgian spinograph, right, which is in a sense the kind of late 19th century Fitbit.
Yeah,
totally. Which is the thing which first produces a graphical readout from a physiological phenomenon in terms of temporal into a graphic. Just a historical remark, but
and also that's used then in the context of Taylorism, Gilbreth's, right, to really tie directly to productivity. Yeah. And so that's also where the 10,000 steps come in, so we need productive.
Just really quickly, this question might be really off the mark, but it's also a little bit related to the subject project, what you were doing, and I was thinking when you were talking about the act of caretaking, so like you have the person in pain, and then it's kind of sliding in and out of objectivity, what are the limits of being objectified. But I was also thinking of the dynamic, that you were kind of talking about the translation between naming pain and then administering care. And I was thinking of other ways that people administer care for pain, and what that labor actually might mean in the dynamic you're looking at, and also how administering care, does its own kind of transformative process. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, who's the subject, who's the object, what's that? You know what I mean? Like, the whole sliding thing was really confusing to me, but also interesting.
Thank you. So your talk reminded me of the one passage in Kate Hale's How We Became Post-Human, when she talks about information losing its body. So her story is of how information loses its body. In your context, I think you're tracing the story of how pain loses its body, and I see your projects as actually giving pain back a body, not the one it started with, but a new one, and that's a kind of experimental intervention.
in the forms in which you reconstitute and translate it. But I was, I guess kind of had two questions, and you can shoot, take a stab at these as you like, but what if you flip it so that you say not fit bit, but how is the bit fit? What does it mean to think of the fitness of a number, not necessarily in a Darwinian sense, but like in this kind of the like endurance, in a kind of endurance sense. And then also with Elaine Scarry's Body and Pain, one of the things she brings up is the significance of torture as a world-destroying tactic. So not just the body, but something about the environment of the subject is destroyed in the process of the torture. So I was wondering what your thoughts might be on the role of environments or environmental, what happens to environments in addition to bodies, or the environments of bodies in the work you're exploring.
Thanks. Unfortunately, I think I only have about 10 seconds to respond to that.
Don't worry about that.
No, I'm just kidding. I don't know if this is working. I think that to the second question, I think, again, going back to the ideas of productivity, where worlds are built to be more productive. Thinking about, Lisa and I were just talking to our students about Fordism and sort of a post-Fordist world in which we live. And one of our students raised their hand and said, but what about Amazon? And we said, well, what about Amazon? And she said, but aren't they basically creating a factory where things move and the person moves? And in fact, Amazon has Fitbits on, or Fitbit adjacents on their employees' wrists to make sure that they are doing the most efficient but also the most productive movement. So I think that's where you see that come in. And making sure they stay on the floor. Thanks for those questions.
I was always wondering, the history of life itself, starting off with not sort of in a much smaller group of people interested in chasing their movements and just quantifying something really, like a complex human being in a way that's not really quantifiable. The desire to do so, from tracing laboriousness, to today we have Fitbits and the English that the data is obscured as translation process is very obscured in the chart. We are much along the complexity of this process was delivered out to us. So I guess I'm wondering, and then going into you were saying about the Amazon workers, so everything that Fitbit, how it relates to in terms of grander scale in the society, how we're starting to look at quantified needs as how it measures productivity. So starting out from something so small as just a desire to do something, to looking at it in the grander scale of society, how do you measure everything?
Well, I think, if you look at the history of like the capital Q, capital S quantified self movement, right? You look at Kevin Kelly, who lives down the street and gets a bunch of his neoliberal friends to say that we will take charge of our bodies, which is absolutely, to your point, Avery, it's something that we all kind of have a desire to do. If you keep tracing it backwards, you see traces of the self-help movement in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You see traces of behaviorism in the 60s and 70s. And what I propose is you can go even further back through biopolitics and governmentality to controls of population and eugenics, right? And sort of making sure that it is the quantification of the self, but both at the service of improving both productivity and health of the collective. And it's also the QS as it stands in the Kevin Kelly sense doesn't exist without collecting all the other data points, right? Without comparing. And so kind of going all the way back to sort of Adolphe Quetelet and the invention of the bell curve and saying that the person in the middle here is the average man, is the perfect person, and then jettisoning the exceptional and the deficient. So all of this is to say that I think that there is definitely a history of a small group of people coming together and saying we want to take control, but I think that looking at that action in the greater context of what it means to say we are part of a bigger society and part of a bigger society that needs to sort of quantify and calculate and measure and track, puts it in more of a sort of problematic lens. My advisor is sitting next to me, so this is terrifying. Next week.
But it is, because you bring it in, once you do 15, you need to do the smart city as a whole. I mean, the wall is going to be measuring us and monitoring us. The doorway, the sidewalks. So what's going to happen with hackers and government agents? I mean, she's right to be frightened.
I mean, we were talking earlier about how they found the Golden State Killer using 23andMe data. Like, hooray! You know? But what happens when they're looking for the people protesting at the border? Right.
Shannon Matter comes up in this regard, right? Her new book, Data Under Code and Clay, 5,000 Years of the Quantified City. And she's sort of like media theory, media archaeology, looking at this sort of assumption that is happening in the contemporary technological moment where the pursuit of the available data bits to make a better quantified self is a new phenomenon. And so she's tracing the ways that this happens in urban spaces over 5,000 years, how public knowledge becomes inscribed in the walls of Roman structures, for example, and a need to sort of rethink, again, the sort of question of inscription, or even rethinking those terms, where information lies, seems like the next step. And thank you, Sarah. Data and Dirt, Code and Clay.
Thanks. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.